I can still remember the first time I encountered schizophrenia. I had just started high school, and teenagers, as they do, had come up with some new slang. They referred to everything and anything that they thought was stupid or crazy as being schizo or psychotic, or the faces on the news of schizophrenia that belonged to killers, or the time that I went to the cinema and the most frightening part was a woman who killed her own children because the voices in her head told her to. And then finally encountering schizophrenia in an academic setting. My philosophy teacher described schizophrenia as multiple personality disorder. And when I proceeded to correct him, I remember him telling me that I was in the wrong. And after all of these encounters, I remember going home and sitting at the table with my two younger brothers and my mom, and enjoying the cacophony of laughter and chatter and teasing and sibling squabbles, because it wasn't always like that. Sometimes, maybe that day, Sammy would forget to wear his headphones and play a YouTube video out loud in the sitting room. Or the neighbors would be having a party, and no matter how loud we put the music, their voices would still bleed into our house. Or maybe it would be completely quiet, and she would just hear voices anyway, the non-existent ones, that she said came through the wall. Her entire demeanor would change as she picked apart the words, and the three of us, being well-versed in her delusions, would know exactly what she was thinking. On those days, you'd have to repeat yourself 3 times before she really understood what you were saying. And when you looked into her normally sensitive brown eyes, you'd be met with a vacant, glassy stare. I mostly remember the confusion that I felt, knowing that my mom was both my favorite person in the world, who loved me and my brothers, supported us, listened to us, and also a diagnosed schizophrenic who lived in a completely different reality than our own. This confusion was the result of my inability to reconcile my reality with the repeated encounters I had with schizophrenia in the real world. Of course, I started asking questions, and pretty soon I was met with a scientific definition. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder marked by impaired thinking, emotions, and behaviors. Patients of schizophrenia are typically unable to filter sensory information and often have an enhanced perception of sounds, colors, and other features of the environment. I was told that my mother had a debilitating brain disease of which, once the symptoms occur, they are almost entirely disabling and last an entire lifetime. While some parts of this definition did ring true, most did not. Yes, my mother had impaired thinking as she believed delusions that weren't true. And yes, she had an enhanced perception of sounds if you count hearing things that weren't there. But she did not have an enhanced perception of colors or other features of the environment. Furthermore, she definitely did not have a debilitating brain disease, as she was able to care for herself and her 3 children. And I refused to believe that her symptoms were going to last an entire lifetime. My mother had been diagnosed before I was born, but for the first 9 years of my life, she did not experience any symptoms at all, and though she was experiencing them in that moment, I refused to believe that that was a lifelong prognosis. Frustrated by this hopeless outlook of schizophrenia, I started asking questions again. I scoured the internet for other stories of schizophrenia, and while many had similar elements to my own, none of them were the same. They were all so unique and individual that I struggled to find one definition of schizophrenia. After searching and searching, I finally found answers in a man named Wim van Os. He's a Dutch psychiatrist who believes that the label of schizophrenia should be replaced by PSS, or Psychotic Spectrum Syndrome. PSS answered so many of my questions that I had about schizophrenia. It explained how schizophrenia is really just an umbrella term that encapsulates a diversity of symptoms that have been thrown together and put into a box. Sure, when it comes to a broken arm, you can list some symptoms and a pretty standard diagnosis will roll out. You'll know how to treat it, put it in a cast, and for most people, in a matter of months, they'll be healed. But when it comes to mental problems, this is all so much harder. They are, for one, mostly very personal, vague, and hard to describe. Psychological complaints have many different causes, and there's always ambiguity surrounding them, as many factors play a role. How these complaints are experienced also differ from person to person. Sorry. We need to start mapping symptoms instead of handing out these broad labels. That's exactly what is achieved with PSS, as it's actually so broad a diagnosis that a psychiatrist would be forced to give individual diagnoses with specific symptoms listed for each patient. No longer being assigned this label that a huge group of people share, we would no longer have the problem of stereotyping and misconceptions that naturally occur when you put such a diverse group of people under one label. Schizophrenia is a broad end to an even broader spectrum. In fact, 8% of the population of the Netherlands will at some point in their life have a psychotic experience. And although 1% is currently diagnosed with schizophrenia, 3.5% would be eligible for the PSS diagnosis. We need to stop focusing on this extreme minority and instead look at the vast, broader majority. Understanding this helped me stop alienating schizophrenia and see it as part of the broader spectrum. A psychotic experience is actually something that everybody goes through. We all translate our external worlds into an internal one. What this means is that everything that you hear, smell, see, touch, or taste, you give meaning and shape to inside of your head. Say that I just watched a horror movie and my friend did not. If we both walk through an empty forest that's dark, it'll be a completely different experience for the both of us. If we hear a twig snap, that sound will have a very different meaning to me than it does to my friend. How we experience our internal world is always a very personalized process. People with PSS are just on one extreme end of that spectrum of how we translate our internal world. And they often have very human reasons for why they do so. Maybe they're stressed, or they feel excluded, or they have childhood trauma. In my mother's case, she experienced psychosis when she moved to a different city and when she divorced my father. Two obviously stress-inducing situations. Psychosis formed her coping mechanism. And don't we all have coping mechanisms? Understanding the very human rationale behind such an alienized concept as schizophrenia makes us realize that people on the PSS spectrum are not so different as we like to believe. Of course, when we create such a defined and narrow label as schizophrenia, we're going to have misconceptions and stereotypes, because what that label has done is create a concept in everybody's mind of the average schizophrenic. It's created a single story that matches nobody's reality. How would you feel if you were reduced to your coping mechanism? If that's all people saw you as? Because that's what we do with people who have schizophrenia. And by doing so, we take away their humanity and reduce them to their label. And what taking away this humanity does is it allows us as a society to morally disengage, to not care. So when people with schizophrenia have reduced housing opportunities and reduced employment opportunities, lower self-esteem, lower happiness, when 1 in 10 schizophrenics will commit suicide, and when 4 in 10 will attempt it, society doesn't care. Of course, I, as a daughter of someone with schizophrenia, feel unable often to tell people, because when I share her label, that's all she becomes in people's minds. She stops being a mother, a daughter, an artist, and most importantly, an equal. Currently, half of the battle of schizophrenia is the illness itself, while the other half is society's perception of it. So isn't it finally time to get rid of such an outdated label and instead replace it with the more humane and less harmful PSS? It's up to everybody to be less judgmental and more understanding, and to be less fearful and more informed. We can choose, as a society, whether we perceive labels as what they are given to us, or whether we choose to see the spectrum and not deprive ourselves of the plethora of human experience. Thank you.